3 minutes after takeoff, disaster struck. Both engines failed, with no power, no runway, and just seconds to decide. Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger aimed for the unthinkable, a water landing in the icy Hudson River. This is the story of US Airways Flight 1549, January 15, 2009. Winter in New York City brought crisp, cold air and a clear, bright sky. At LaGuardia Airport, life buzzed as usual. US Airways Flight 1549 passengers shuffled through the terminal, lugging carry-ons and clutching tickets. Some were business travelers mentally rehearsing their next presentations. Others were families dreaming of warm vacations, and a few simply passed through on their way to other destinations. The Airbus A320 was set to carry 150 passengers and 5 crew members from New York to Charlotte, North Carolina. It was a flight so ordinary that no one gave it a second thought. For most, it was merely a layover before continuing to their final destinations. Captain Sully and First Officer Skiles conducted pre-flight checks in the cockpit with practiced precision. Sully, 57, was a seasoned pilot with over 19,000 flight hours and a lifetime of experience. From flying fighter jets in the US Air Force to piloting commercial aircraft, known for his calm demeanor and technical expertise, Sully treated this as another day at work. First Officer Skiles, however, was relatively new to the Airbus A320, making this flight a milestone in his career. Still, he was a seasoned aviator with thousands of hours logged in other aircraft models. Both men were steady, professional, and prepared for what they expected to be a routine flight. Pre-flight checks complete, Sully announced as they finalized preparations. The engines hummed to life and the plane began taxiing toward the runway. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats, confident in the crew's professionalism, flipping through magazines, making small talk, or staring out the windows at the endless city below. At 3:26 p.m., the control tower cleared Flight 1549 for takeoff. With a burst of power, the aircraft roared down the runway, lifting effortlessly into the winter sky. No one aboard could have anticipated how this ordinary flight would turn into one of aviation's most extraordinary stories of survival and heroism. Barely 3 minutes after takeoff, US Airways Flight 1549 faced the unthinkable. As the Airbus A320 climbed steadily to 2,800 feet, everything seemed routine. Passengers relaxed in their seats, gazing at the crisp winter sky, unaware that disaster was imminent. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Canada geese. The flock collided with the Airbus A320, tearing into its engines with a force no machine could withstand. In an instant, the plane was crippled, both engines silenced, leaving the aircraft in a freefall toward disaster. The passengers heard a series of deafening thuds inside the cabin, followed by an eerie silence. The familiar hum of the engines vanished. Startled cries and gasps spread as the unsettling realization sank in. Something had gone wrong. In the cockpit, chaos erupted. The instruments flashed red, warning lights illuminated the control panel, and alarms blared. Both engines had ingested multiple geese, causing immediate catastrophic failures. Maintaining composure despite the dire situation, Skiles reported the critical issue. We lost thrust in both engines. Sully, however, understood the gravity of the situation instantly. A dual engine failure at low altitude was every pilot's worst nightmare. With no thrust, the aircraft began losing altitude rapidly. There was no time to deliberate, no room for error. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cactus 1549, Sully declared, initiating a call to air traffic control. His calm yet urgent tone betrayed the high stakes. The controller responded quickly, offering nearby runways for an emergency landing, but Sully's assessment was grim. The aircraft lacked the power and altitude to reach any airport safely. Unable, Sully replied firmly, his mind racing for an alternative. Years of experience told him that conventional solutions wouldn't work here. The plane was gliding, but gravity was relentless. In the cabin, fear took hold. Passengers clutched each other, some whispering prayers, others frozen in silence. Crew members sprang into action, instructing everyone to remain seated and brace for impact. In those harrowing moments, Sully's focus shifted. His mission was now singular, to land the plane safely no matter what it took. What followed would cement his place in history as one of aviation's greatest heroes. As the Airbus A320 plummeted through the crisp winter air, Captain Sully maintained his composure, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is US Airways 1549. We've lost thrust in both engines. We're turning back," he reported to air traffic control, his words calm yet urgent. The response came immediately. "Runway 4 is available at LaGuardia. Can you make it back?" But Sully had already assessed the situation with decades of flight experience. The aircraft was no longer flying. It was gliding. Altitude was bleeding away too quickly, and turning back to LaGuardia wasn't an option. The distance was insurmountable. The plane's weight, the drag, and the unforgiving clock left no room for false hope. "Negative," Sully responded decisively. "We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson." The controller, momentarily caught off guard, hesitated. "Say again?" "We're landing in the Hudson," Sully declared with unwavering resolve. It was a decision few would dare to make. A commercial airliner, powerless, descending toward the freezing waters below. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Could he pull off the impossible? Those words carried an extraordinary weight. Landing a commercial airliner on water was perilous, often ending in tragedy. Yet Sully's mind was already racing ahead, calculating the risks and possibilities. In the cockpit, there was no panic, only determination. Sully and Skiles worked in unison, their training and instincts guiding their actions. Their goal was clear. They had to bring the aircraft down safely. What unfolded next was a decision born of courage, precision, and sheer determination. A choice that would forever redefine the limits of human resilience and ingenuity. For anyone unfamiliar with the geography of New York City, the Hudson River is an unlikely lifeline. But for Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger, it was the only viable option. The Airbus A320 was in trouble, and every second mattered. Attempting to land on solid ground meant risking catastrophe. Densely packed neighborhoods, bustling city streets, and towering skyscrapers left no room for error. The river, cold and unyielding in the middle of winter, offered a narrow chance of survival. Sully's voice cut through the chaos in the cockpit. "Prepare for ditching," he said firmly to First Officer Jeff Skiles. There was no time for doubt or debate. The engines were silent, crippled by the bird strike, and the Airbus was now gliding, descending rapidly toward the icy water below. Although the aircraft wasn't designed to land on water, Sully's deep understanding of its systems gave him the confidence to try. He took manual control of the plane, hands steady on the yoke, and adjusted the glide path with surgical precision. His eyes darted between the instruments and the water ahead, calculating every angle and every descent rate, ensuring the smoothest possible landing. Flight attendants sprang into action in the cabin, their training taking over. The air was tense as they moved swiftly down the aisles, instructing passengers to brace for impact. "Brace, brace, heads down, stay down," they shouted, their voices loud and commanding over the hum of the failing aircraft. Passengers gripped their armrests, knuckles turning white. Fear hung heavily in the air, palpable and inescapable. Some whispered hurried prayers, clutching rosaries, or closing their eyes tightly. Others sat frozen, wide-eyed and silent, their minds were unable to process what was happening. A mother pulled her child closer, murmuring words of comfort she hoped would shield him from the reality of their situation. A businessman stared blankly at the seat back before him, his mind racing through everything left unfinished, calls unmade, goodbyes unsaid. From the cockpit, the view of the Hudson loomed more prominent with every passing second. The Winter River was an expanse of dark, frigid water, its surface rippled by the wind and currents. To most, it looked like an unforgiving grave, but to Sully, it was a runway, the only runway that mattered now. His focus sharpened, his voice calm as he communicated with air traffic control one last time. The landing was coming. Every decision, every movement in these final moments would decide the fate of all 155 souls on board. At 3:31 p.m., just over 5 minutes after takeoff, Flight 1549 hit the Hudson River. For all the precision and skill Sully had used to guide the crippled aircraft down, there was no escaping the force of the impact. The descent had been as smooth as possible, but the jolt was violent when the fuselage struck the icy water. Passengers were hurled forward in their seats, seatbelts digging painfully into their waists and shoulders. Bags flew from overhead compartments, slamming into the cabin walls or tumbling into the aisles. A collective gasp filled the air, followed by the eerie sound of silence, stunned disbelief at what had just happened. Outside, a massive wave exploded outward, spraying freezing water over the wings and windows, coating the glass in an icy film. For a moment, the plane bobbed, and the passengers inhaled sharply as though waiting to see if it would hold. Then reality struck. Water was seeping into the cabin at an alarming rate. The freezing river found every crack and crevice, pooling at passengers' feet as it rose with terrifying speed. Inside, chaos brewed, but the crew's voices cut through the tension like lifelines. "Stay calm, head to the exits," one flight attendant shouted, her tone sharp but steady. Adrenaline powered her as she directed panicked passengers to the emergency doors. Others in the crew worked to deploy the inflatable slides, which, in this life-or-death scenario, doubled as lifeboats. The cabin erupted into a flurry of movement. Passengers scrambled over seats and toward the exits, some wading through water now ankle-deep. Outside, the inflatable rafts slapped against the frigid water as they unfurled. People climbed onto the wings, their bodies shaking as the freezing January air tore into them. Breath turned to mist, and the cold pierced through layers of clothing. Those still in the cabin reached out to help others, parents hoisting children, younger passengers supporting older people. On the wings, the danger wasn't over. The ice-cold water lapped at passengers' shoes, seeping through to numb their feet. Some stood knee-deep, arms wrapped around their bodies for warmth. Others huddled in the rafts, pulling shivering children close to shield them from the brutal wind. Despite the terror and confusion, small acts of courage emerged. Hands reached out, voices reassured, and strangers leaned on one another, unified in their determination to survive. When Flight 1549 hit the Hudson, ferry operators and emergency crews sprang into action. Their eyes locked on the impossible sight, a massive airliner floating on the icy river. Within moments, boats sped toward the scene, their crews ready to rescue passengers clinging to life in the freezing January air. The plume of water and the sight of the airliner bobbing on the freezing river jolted them into action. There was no hesitation. Operating one of the Hudson River ferries, Captain Vincent Lombardi immediately sprang into motion. "Get the life jackets ready," he barked to his crew, his voice firm but steady. He knew time was critical. Every second counted. While his crew scrambled to grab equipment, Lombardi steered the ferry toward the scene, its engines roaring to life as it cut through the icy river. The frigid January air was brutal. and the Hudson's temperature was unforgiving. Each passing moment increased the risk of hypothermia for passengers stranded on the wings and in the rafts. Shivering uncontrollably, some clung to each other for warmth, their faces pale and their breath visible in the freezing air. Others stood ankle-deep in icy water on the plane's wings, their shoes and clothes soaked through. Every minute spent exposed to the elements could be life-threatening. Within minutes, Lombardi's ferry and other nearby vessels, including Coast Guard boats and private rescue craft, surrounded the downed aircraft like a fleet of lifelines. Rescuers leaned over the edges of their ships, shouting words of encouragement as they extended their arms and ropes to pull people to safety. Ferry crews tossed life jackets into the water and hauled drenched, trembling passengers onto their decks. Blankets were draped over survivors' shoulders, and rescuers worked quickly to warm them, rubbing their arms and speaking reassuringly as panic turned to relief. The Coast Guard arrived shortly after, their vessels cutting through the water precisely. Teams worked together, transferring passengers from the rafts and wings to boats equipped with first aid supplies. The minutes felt like hours in the freezing water, but the coordinated response was swift and heroic. Despite the biting cold and chaos, rescuers focused on a singular mission: saving lives. Every survivor pulled from the Hudson was a testament to their courage and determination in the face of disaster. Sully and Skiles remained focused in the cockpit, even as the freezing water rose. The cabin was eerily silent now, save for the sound of water sloshing against the fuselage and the distant hum of rescue boats. Waist-deep in the frigid water, the two men moved methodically, conducting one final sweep of the aircraft. Their eyes scanned every row, every corner of the cabin, ensuring no one had been left behind. Each step was deliberate. Responsibility bore down on them, but neither man faltered. "Cabin clear," Sully finally called out, his voice steady despite the bitter cold and exhaustion beginning to creep in. The words carried immense weight, signaling that their duty, the safety of every life on board, had been fulfilled. With the final confirmation, Sully and Skiles climbed toward the exits, their movements slowed by the icy water and soaked uniforms. They emerged into the harsh January air, their breath misting in the cold. Rescue workers were waiting, calling to them from a nearby boat. The two men joined the last group of passengers, carefully stepping onto the rescue vessel as hands reached to steady them. They looked back at the plane for the first time, partially submerged, battered, yet still afloat. It was a surreal sight, a stark contrast to their relief. Together, Sully and Skiles shared a glance, unspoken but profound. Everyone had made it out alive. Their mission was complete. The news spread like wildfire. Within moments, the incredible story of Flight 1549 was dominating headlines nationwide. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors slicing through the cold winter air as news crews captured stunning footage of the Airbus A320 floating improbably in the Hudson River. The sight of passengers perched on the wings, huddled in rafts, and ferries rushing to the scene was surreal and unforgettable. By the time the final count was confirmed, all 155 on board had been rescued. Not a single life had been lost, a near miraculous outcome that defied the odds. It wasn't long before Captain Chesley, Sully Sullenberger, became a household name. Hailed as a hero by passengers, the media, and the public, Sully remained humble despite widespread praise. "I was just doing my job," he said during the interviews, his calm demeanor echoing his composure in the cockpit. Despite the accolades, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, immediately launched a formal investigation. Their analysis included simulations suggesting that, under ideal conditions, Sully might have been able to return to LaGuardia, but Sully firmly defended his decision. With the information I had at the time, the Hudson was the only safe option, he explained. His choice had been driven by instinct, experience, and a clear commitment to preserving lives, a decision that ultimately proved unassailable. The world may have been questioned, but history would vindicate him. The miracle on the Hudson quickly symbolized hope, resilience, and the extraordinary human spirit. In a world often marked by stories of tragedy, Flight 1549 stood out as a rare triumph, a reminder of what is possible when skill, preparation, and courage align. It wasn't just about the crew's remarkable professionalism under unimaginable pressure. It was also about the bravery of ordinary people, passengers who found strength, compassion, and unity in the face of fear. The image of the Airbus A320 floating on the icy Hudson, passengers huddled on its wings waiting for rescue, became an enduring symbol of survival. It was a story that resonated far beyond New York City, inspiring people around the world. Captain Sullenberger and his crew's calm determination, the ferry operators and rescuers' quick response, and the passengers' collective will to survive transformed an emergency landing into something extraordinary. Today, the miracle on the Hudson remains one of aviation's most remarkable and uplifting stories. It is a testament to teamwork, preparation, and human perseverance in adversity. On that freezing January day, the Hudson River, so often seen as cold and unforgiving, didn't claim lives. Instead, it became a runway to safety, carrying 155 souls to survival and leaving behind a legacy of hope.